Hi, and welcome everybody to Middlesim Eschatology. It is now 7:30. I've been dealing with this thing for half an hour, and it was not being set up correctly. I don't know if the link is still being working and if people are able to join me or not. I did everything I could to get you up on coming out of preterism is where, and a couple hoping that is working. So right now, I'm not sure if anybody's able to get on here or not. And I was hoping to be able to talk with people and chat and see your questions live concerning my new book and what is Middlesim Eschatology. And I can just kind of go on and ramble on all night, but there would be no different than doing just a YouTube channel. So I am still trying to figure out if anybody is able to hook up and connect based on that. And so far I've gotten nothing. So I don't know what the issue is. I'm refreshing everything. And we'll see what happens here in a second when it refreshes. And I'm still waiting for a refresh. The live stream takes up a lot of computer effort here, it seems like. And so it just kind of goes slow. And figure out finally, let's see. Yes, I got one person on. Okay, so the link works. The link works. That's the main thing I wanted to know. Okay, I'm glad you could be here. And so now, if you want to chat in something, say hi to let me know you're still here on this page. And let me know who I'm talking to. It'd be nice. They don't give you that information until you actually type in something and let me know. And I don't know what the delay is or anything like that. So, all right, with that said, and with things going on, and I find out I finally got it now on there. And I'm checking also on the Coming Out of Preterism page. I can check those things out there. So Faye says, yes, you are live. And there she is. Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Thank you. Hey, this is the first time, so I want to make sure. All right, let's begin here. And first of all, I just want to cover basically what the book is about and what is going on with Middlesim Eschatology, exactly what it is. And so to begin with, I talking about it, it was about 5 years ago when I got introduced to preterism and took a look at it, and pretty much had my opinion stuffed down my throat because I did not know how to come back all the way and really deal with the things that they were saying. So what I did was I went back to school. I earned my master in divinity, and then I went back, and after that, and now just finished up my master's in theology. And to me, it's the education. It's all about the education. The more education you get, the more knowledgeable you can be about something. And so that was my whole goal of going back to school and being able to really put things correctly together. And I won't deal with preterism right now in that regard. I'll start first of all here with the book. Now, the book, basically what the book is about, of course, is it's written to people and it just describes the end time view from a premillennialist post-trib view, which is the view of the early church fathers. It is a lot of things that they believed in, and yes, there's added information to it and added understandings about scriptures that are in there. And so I've written it for people just to be able to get that kind of a general idea. But where I focus in on is about the second coming. because everything hinges on the second coming. For every preterist, for dispensationalist, the whole thing all hinges on the second coming. And in discussions and everything else that I get in with preterists, it will always go back to the second coming and being able to prove and talk about, did it happen in AD 70? And then, of course, they're going to try and tie everything, all prophecy, into AD 70 and prove that it all existed. Now, just then for a background, what the premillennial post-trib position is, and I'll just give the brief outline of chronology of events there. The idea is that we go through life and all that, then without warning, without a pre-rapture or anything else, that we find ourselves, the church, being judged for its failure. And if you just look around today, you can see it's kind of happening that way. And that's what the first 6 letters are about in Revelation, is judgment that comes on the church. And those are warnings for the church of judgments to come, is the specifics of that. Then it gets into the events of the last days, meaning Revelations 1, it says the events that are soon to take place. So everything that's in Revelation is about events that are to happen. And I can get into about what soon means and all of that. But I don't think I'm not going to take the real time yet just to do that just yet. But the idea is that the tribulation starts to happen. And it's at that tribulation where the beast is ruled for 42 months and comes to its end, that Christ comes in here to save what remnant is left over, because it says many of the saints will be killed and they'll be standing before the throne, waiting, how long, O Lord, will you avenge our deaths? And so it's at his coming. Now, that what happens is that the saints, the ones who have died, are resurrected bodily. We who are alive are changed automatically. Both groups meet him up into the air. That word there is ampantesis. We meet him in the air and we become his army, as Revelation 19 describes. So all these events and everything of Revelation culminate in chapter 19. And then in chapter 19, Christ returns with his army, defeats the army of the beast, and it says that the beast and the false prophet are captured and thrown into the lake of fire alive, not dead. And for sake of consistency, think about it. Nero committed suicide in 68. How can he be captured alive if he's the beast? Or how is an army captured alive when it says the whole army was destroyed? And it was not a kingdom, but this is an army led by the beast and the false prophet against Christ, who's returning with his armies. And so this is what we call the rapture. That is the second coming of Christ. All of that ball of wax is wrapped up into there. Now, when we go into Revelations 20, after Christ returns, the first thing that happens is it's Satan who is put into prison. This is not a binding of authority or anything else. It cannot happen in 33. This is something he is saying is happening after he returns, that Satan is bound. And because the historical point is that since 33 AD, there is no way we can sit there and say that Satan is bound up and thrown into a pit, sealed up and not allowed to deceive the nations anymore, because the whole Islamic religion is a deception by Satan and an imitation of Christianity. And it is Satan's way, of course, coming against Christianity. That has been going on since 600s AD with Muhammad, and with his coming in the whole religion starting from that point, and the way it's deceived those Middle Eastern nations. It's been there. So you can't sit there and tell me that Satan's been bound up and not deceiving the nations any longer. That, to me, is just kind of inconsistent to be able to say that. So Revelation shows that what happens is, and I know this is a thing for you, Faye, a touch point, but it starts in there with those that have been beheaded, those who have been killed during the tribulation. Those are the ones that arise, and he calls this the first resurrection. And what he's getting at, yes, there's a little bit of a recapitulation, because it has to go back a little bit and explain that these saints who are being vindicated, those that are coming to life, and are being resurrected in this first resurrection to rule and reign with him from Jerusalem, the camp of the saints, the city that he loves. If it's a recap, why is he saying that, according to preterists, why is he saying that Jerusalem during this whole time is the camp of the saints? That doesn't work. You can't sit there and say this is the city, the camp of the saints, the city he loves, prior to 70 AD, of course. You can't uphold that kind of an interpretation because God's anger was poured out on Jerusalem in 80. You go through the 1,000 years, and there's a perfect timeline where there's a restoration of things. Without Satan's influence, there's a restoring of health back to the earth, in a sense, of nations. No more wars, no more nations fighting against nations. Christ has put an end to this, all according to prophecy of the Old Testament. And then at the end of that the perfect time period, Satan is released again, and he again goes out and deceives the nations and gathers a second army. Now, the first army, the battle is actually at Gog and Magog. It's in the valley of Megiddo. It is not surrounding Jerusalem, if anybody ever really paid attention to that. But this one here is a surrounding of Jerusalem with his armies, with this vast number that comes against him. And there's no battle that takes place. Christ calls down fire, and that's the end of this army in a heartbeat. And what we have is just everything ends right there. What we have is a picture next of the Great White Throne Judgment, where everybody who's ever lived from Adam all the way through are standing before the Lord to be judged. The first and the last, the first man Adam, second man Christ, everybody that's ever lived all the way through is going to stand before him in judgment for the deeds done while in the body. Now, if you notice in Revelation 20, that phrase is kind of repeated twice. And the reason it's repeated twice is because that's a Jewish, very Hebrew and a Jewish way of speaking, is that when you emphasize things, you repeat it because you're trying to get it across that, hey, people pay attention to this. So everybody stands before the Lord, and there's a judgment. Now, while this judgment is taking place, God is remaking the earth. It's being made renewed, made like new. It's not being destroyed, which a lot of preterists sit there and say that's what we're talking about. The old earth is destroyed. He's got to make a whole brand new one. No such thing. In the same way that the world of the ungodly was destroyed in Noah's day, where the flood came on the whole earth and killed everyone, now fire destroys everything that's on this earth, and it's remade again and to be made like new. So all the works of man, the elements, all the stoichia, all the elements of this world that were used to make up man's creation is completely burned away and taken away, and God restores it to its pristine condition. After the judgment, we are before the Lord in that everybody whose names was not written in the book of life is not going outside the city. They're going outside, period, to that place where they dwell, which is the lake of fire. Yes, Revelation 22 uses that idea of them being outside. And the idea in Jewish thought, of course, is that if they're not inside the city, they can't cause trouble. So John, in that revelation, in that vision, he's seeing a city that is safe now from the evilness of the world and all these other things. So that stuff no longer is there and happens. My cat's playing around behind me here. So once that's done, those that are left over are nothing but the Christians. Everybody who has followed the Lord, whose name was book in the Lamb's Book of Life, is the one who is coming down with him back to this earth to live with him as he had started way back in the beginning. That was his whole purpose, was a place for man to dwell with God forever and for him to live face to face. But yes, man had to go through that testing first. And that was what this whole thing has been about. If Adam had chosen the other way instead of the tree of good and evil, if he had chosen the other, life would have been confirmed on him, and God and him would have been face to face, but there would be no all these people up here. So God wasn't just looking for two. He wanted the whole thing. He understood the whole plan. He knew the way people were, the way he created them. He knows the potentials for all of that. He knows everything. And his whole plan was about getting a people who love him because we chose to love him, not because we are forced to like robots or like angels who have no choice. And that is where the continuation of our life begins. Paul says it hasn't even entered in the imagination of man what God has in store for us. So that is basically it in a nutshell. So the idea, of course, is the second coming. It's the rapture and the second coming happening at the same time with the resurrection of the dead, little bodies coming out of the grave, and us ruling and reigning with him during that 1,000 years, then judgment, and then the new heavens and the earth finally arriving. And so John uses all this apocalyptic language to describe all of those things, of those events, of things to take place. And I'm just thinking about all the preterist arguments. I mean, there's 100,000 of them all the way through, and it's like, where do you start to tear apart their whole paradigms and why it's wrong from the beginning? And I'm going to pull up here something, I believe, but I was not able to find the post for it. But I wanted to deal with these three basic here from every preterist. This paradigm to deal with this. It's really important. Watson states, and not word for word, but is that he does his own Bible study, meaning that he invites Bible study, but we're not going to other scholars in grad or anything else. We're just going to be dealing with strictly what. And now the cat wants out. You can see him in there. And throwing me off here. Hold on a second. Let me go take care of this. Oops. Hold on a second. I just got it. Go. I didn't know what's outside that door. I didn't want anybody to see my wife. Anyway, okay. Getting back to John Watson here. I knew that cat was going to be a problem when he came in here. The idea is that Church of Christ know that they don't listen to creeds. They don't listen to early church fathers. They pretty much reject most scholarship and say that we really don't need that. But what we need, of course, is to learn from each other right here and right now. Now, this is kind of ironic because here's what happens. You can sit there and say that and take that kind of a position, but Michael Miano, Don Preston, they're all writing books. Why? Because they want to teach their system and their paradigm, and they want everybody to know for it. Right now, Michael Miano is going through Bondor's book, step-by-step kind of a thing, and he's teaching people from out of that book. So if you're sitting there teaching people, and then you tell me that you reject the early church five because they wrote a book about their beliefs, and so they're all wrong, they were an apostate or anything else, so that we're not supposed to pay attention to them. But if you actually read the works of the early, it's absolutely ridiculous that you reject them or say that they are an apostasy. There's just no way you can. These are men of faith who died horrible deaths, some of them, in order to stand for Christ. Now, I'm looking to see. Okay. I'm reading your comment here, Faye. When did people start understanding on earth? It seems to be a crucial point that many don't grasp. True. Yes. They don't accept the idea that is coming down. But of course, Joel Sexton accuses me of following after what's the thing? And here's the issue. He wrote, my video stopped. Ooh. Back up again. I don't know what's on there. Joel Sexton, N.T. Wright, that's where I was going. It's book by Hope. In section in there, coming his view in the second coming all the way through, and his beliefs about what he said. Now, when I studied my own, when somebody told me about Matthew 24, and I went back into it, and I said, okay, where do you divide up Matthew 24? How do you divide it up? And I couldn't find any place. And so when I got done with my studies and everything else, I said that the futurists or dispensationalists cannot divide Matthew 24 up. It had to have all happened in this generation. So my next question is that, okay, if it was supposed to happen in this generation, didn't it? Why did the early church fathers all say that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD But that was not the second coming. I mean, if it's the second coming language is in Matthew 24, then they should have understood that the same as us. Now, without going too far from your question, Faye, the idea is that N.T. Wright explains this whole thing and why life that we're having is going to be back here on Earth, and goes through those whole points of that we were created for Earth and eternity on Earth, and what God has in store for us, we have no idea. But that is something that he draws out very much in that book and what it's all about and why. All right, now going back then to Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse, I had to look at that. Where do you get that distinction? Where do you get the division? And I had to be honest with myself. And Joel, is questioning on me in that and putting up all those videos to refute me. Well, why is it that the early church fathers did not believe that Matthew 24 ever talked about reading N.T. Wright or anybody else? I looked it up for myself and I researched it. And some of it is based on Don's comments, of course, about we shall meet him in the air. The whole idea of the Old Testament coming in power and glory and, the destruction and vindication and the judgment and all of that, everything from the Old Testament. So what would they have understood versus us? Why is it that we confuse the whole issue? So what I did was, Don talks about Son of Man coming on clouds has nothing to do with Christ coming down to earth. And that is his argument in the book, that everything about the second coming is not Christ coming to the earth, but it is his coming to Jerusalem in judgment. And that's what the whole language was. So when you go back to Daniel 7, verses 13, 14, and basically it says is that it's the Son of Man coming in clouds, and he is being presented before the Ancient of Days. He is coming and being presented to God who's up in heaven. So this coming that Jesus is using about the Son of Man coming on clouds has nothing to do with the second coming. It has everything to do with the idea that because Jesus ascended into heaven from him, and he sits down at the right hand, a kingdom is given to him. He sends judgment in the form of an army that surrounds Jerusalem and does it. That is the Old Testament prescription of how God judged nations, was by sending an army. Now, get this correlation here. In Revelations, God again sends an army to judge the kingdom of the beast. What army is it? Talk about the greatest idea of vindication. It's everybody he killed. Think about it. Everybody who he's ever killed, every Christian that has been killed or has died, and all of us who are alive or changed, we are the ones that are caught up to become his army. So we are the army that comes back down with Christ in our vindication and wipes out the kingdom of the beast and the Antichrist and ends all that. That's just a side note. So whenever you find in the Gospels the phrase Son of Man coming on clouds, like even in Matthew 26, where he was standing before Caiaphas and he said, from now on, from this point after, right here, after this, you might judge me here, but you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand. That phrase of sitting on the right hand means equal authority. If I've got the right hand of somebody, that means I have the same authority as the person who's standing on the other side of me. And so Jesus has the right authority. Also, it says in John 5, he's been given all authority to judge because he is the Son of Man. And that again comes directly from Daniel 7. So you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand, coming on clouds. And the coming on clouds, just like all predators will tell you, it is a statement of judgment, of coming judgment. So where do I make the distinction then between what happened in 70 AD and what we claim is the future second coming of Christ? Well, first of all, if you examine the events of 70 AD, I'm sorry, but Christ didn't return. Jesus himself did not descend out of heaven. Zechariah 14, his feet will stand on Mount Zion. He said he would return in the same way as you saw him go. Every eye will see him. John even said, we shall see him as he is when he comes. there's all kinds of language in there that says that they will see Jesus when he comes. Now, Jesus is not clouds flying over Jerusalem in AD 70. This is to be Jesus himself who descends out of heaven. And that is this distinction. That is the difference between AD 70 and Revelation. Now, in my book, I deal with all of that. I deal why there is no promise of a second coming in the Gospels or even mentioned. And then I find out that's exactly the same position that N.T. Wright takes. So getting back to the book, I bring all of that out in the first half of that. I go through that whole series. And then the last part of the book is I'm dealing with my blog and a lot of the things that I've written over the years, and kind of edited them and put them together, kind of put them in order. And so that's what that whole part is the different arguments that I have with, or I've had with preterists. Now, I'm going to try to pull this page back up, and hopefully it doesn't think too much. Now, as far as I know, I'm going to still be alive. Now, I mentioned about Don Watson saying that so they don't listen to the preachers and listen to the creeds or anything else, but yet they go to preterist books and read them and learn from them. Because a lot of things that you hear from people is just a repeating of the same arguments that Don Preston brings. John Watson then talked about the charge against the ECF. The early church were wrong. And here's a point I brought up 1,000 times, and I haven't heard not one preterist ever deal with this. And I would love to hear a question from a preterist on this, why this is not true. The point. The early church fathers, there's two basic ones. One is historical events that happened. We have multiple cases, men of honor, claimed and said the fact, that John 100 AD to about 98, between 98 and 100 AD, when he died, and he was buried in Ephesus. Stephen's were all raptured out, and so any of these statements, of course, have to be false. Therefore, those people have to be liars. You read the letters between Clement and Ignatius, men who let John up into about there, which was about 100. Irenaeus wrote 50 or so of these in 300 years. Of course, basic things dealing with all the heretics, the Gnostics, paganism, issues there, and they're talking and they're writing back and forth together, and they're tied how they were killed because of their faith. So these letters cover two different things. One, they teach us about the doctrine, the things that they believed in. And nothing right. Nobody has ever argued that their doctrine was perfect about everything. They disagreed on a lot of different small points and fine points and things like this. And yes, there was a lot of things that were added in and everything else. But it is the doctrine of the Trinity that they held to, that they made the standard. That is the standard for Christianity. You cannot be a Christian and think and believe that Christ was a man that became a God or anything else. Father, God, and Son are equal, all three equal and one. They are one in essence, of the same substance, but three different persons. That is part of the mystery of what the Trinity is. Jesus is fully God and he is fully man. And those things were all ironed out in those days. The second thing that they ironed out was the incarnation and understanding Christ, who is God, became a man. When he ascended into heaven, he never stopped being a man, because even Paul says that there's one mediator between God and man, and he still is that mediator, the man Christ Jesus. So he's still man, fully God, and that never changes. Okay, so there's the doctrines that they established, and then of course your 66 books that we use, those basic books were also given up to us by them. So to sit there and say that these guys were all wrong and all messed up, you have to throw all that stuff out. And no preterists will answer that honestly. They tell us about history and doctrine. When it comes to history about John living or who was the pastor at such and such a church in Ephesus at that time, or who was the pastor at such and such a church, the historical records show that so-and-so became the bishop of Clement became the bishop of Rome at a certain time, and this is when his rule, or as Pope, ended. Okay, they've got those records, and they're confirmed by many people. So the history has always been tied up into the Bible. Luke 2, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Because of that statement right there, we know when Jesus, at the time of Caesar Augustus, we have it because of those statements. So somebody talked about, how do you tie this into history? We don't need history. We don't need the evidence and all of that. But people, if Jesus and his coming changed this whole world, what do you think his second coming would have done? Made it the same and would have stayed the same as it was? There's no difference between 70 AD and after AD 70. People were still dying. People are still pain, suffering. The curse still exists. All of those things go. So, of course, what the preterist has to do is turn it all spiritual, because those things don't line up. And, of course, what Joel Sexton is doing, what other people are trying to do, is all prove that it was spiritual. And all the things being fulfilled are all spiritual. And then it's just, it doesn't work out to find details. So when we get down to it, even John Watson was talking about, and he says, well, they said it was a coming, but when they talk about it, and you look at the context of when they're saying this coming is about, it's about coming of judgment. You look, because every father, every statement that we get says that come future. For example, was called in AD 70. He wrote his book, and in his book he talked about the death of the destruction of Jerusalem. He talked about it, and he said they got what they deserved. And then in the next breath he says he's still looking forward to the second coming. So when we look at the second coming and the Olivet, know that issue is resolved. And any preterist needs to look at that Daniel 7, 13, 14, and I've tried it with Green and others, and they say, well, that doesn't mean it's not the second coming, and that doesn't mean this, that doesn't mean that. And flat out what you do is you make statements that are simply not true, and they become bogus. Now, when I look at doctrine and theology, and things that come up, lately it's just gotten into a real mess with what people are saying. And people are not, especially predators, are not false and put two and two together. There's some predators who would put some Watson's posts. And this is Robert Bruna, or Bunick, excuse me. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. To Edward Smith, even mandatory sentences performed, not before. Read the definition carefully. Now he's quoting from Edward Smith and something he said. Now Robert says, looks like you do believe in the primordial sin causing. So I'm going to ask you, this: a converted Christian, the saint with all the sin, blood of Christ, die physically. Why does he still experience the punishment if he has no? Didn't Jesus sacrifice pay so we don't have to? Now this answer is simple. All of those verses, Paul, physical death, but spiritual, which started with Adam's disobedience, separation from God, separation that continued to Jesus. So if Jesus physical death, he failed miserably, since everybody, saved or unsaved, still experiences physical death. Now, this is the basic argument that's given by every preterist. I'm going to go through this real maybe technically and exegetically, because what I hear from exegetically from John Watts, David Yates, and it's not exegesis at all. We don't take one scripture and we go to another scripture and try to figure out what this scripture says because of that. That's not exegesis. Exegesis at its heart is understanding the words that are being spoken first. And that is the important issue of looking at the words that are being said and what's first. Then you understand the context. Then you understand the fuller, broader. Then you go to other verses, add some kind of understanding to it. So going back to Robert's answer, why do the converted Christian and the faithful child of God, the saints with all the sins washed away, still die physically? Now, I know there's been a lot of conversation with death, with Don Press about spiritual death, physical death, and what kind of from Adam. I could write about it, but maybe it's here will make it a little, because everything written, every little detail is important for a reason. Let's look at something very quickly. When Jesus said, or excuse me, when God said in the garden, if you eat of the tree, you will surely die. And I know Scott Frost has gone, Sam Frost, it's not Scott, Sam Frost has gone on and has talked about all this before, and I don't think people have paid attention. Oh, that Hebrew phrase, mut to mut, is the same phrase that's used all the way through the Old Testament where when God gave the law and he said, if you do such and such, you sleep with your sister, or whatever the law was, he says, you will surely be put to death. You will die on that day. It means the same thing. You are going to be put to death for what you did wrong. That's a violation of the law. Therefore, you are going to suffer the punishment of being killed for that. Explain to me how being killed for a sin is the same thing as physical death, the natural physical death of dying when you get older and older. It doesn't. It has nothing to do with that whatsoever. So predators assume that because they were dust, they were mortal, and they were going to eventually die anyway, and all of that. But yet they can't explain why he lived for 900 years. The idea is that man was created immortal. And somebody brought up and said, well, what about the seasons? We know there has to be the passings of the seasons. There's going to be this. And so the natural order of things, I'm sorry, the natural order of things was upset by sin when sin was introduced and the ground was cursed. In the curse, he says, cursed is the ground for your sake. And that included all of creation, was cursed with the thorns, the thistles, and doing things. Adam walked with the animals in the garden and he named them all. I don't see a lion coming up and attack him. In fact, if you look at Genesis 1, it says he gave green plants for every animal, and that includes the lions, the tigers, and the bears. They all eat green plants, food, vegetables. There was no killing and murder in the garden. People were not growing up and dying. Animals were not growing old and dying. Trees and the seasons and plants. I'm sorry. Life is called life when there is blood that flows through it. Plants do not have blood. Their life is not in their blood. There are certain plants I can cut in half and put in the ground and they'll continue to grow. I can cut them off from the root. It's not life in the sense of what God says is life, and that is the life of the animal is in his blood. So that comparison is just completely kind of foolishness to say that death existed because of all the changing seasons and everything else. And let me challenge Michael Miano in covenant creation. When you look at the Genesis account, it says that the sun and the moon and stars were not even made till the fourth day. Well, he says, well, because that doesn't work out scientifically, therefore it can't be scientifically correct. Therefore, it's not meant to be taken literally as the creation of the earth. And wow, this earth, we don't even, in the way God did it. I don't know how else to put this, is that, yes, Genesis of life and Adam. I mean, even Paul said Adam was the first man. All people came from Eve. why would Adam have to be born of dust if he was already a man born from somebody else? I mean, the issues that they bring up are just nonsensical whatsoever. So Adam is immortal. He has that choice between knowing what is good and evil, and the choice between immortality. And it says that he chose to eat of the tree. Now, as a result of eating of the tree and the threat that came on him, the idea was that he was to die the day that he ate. It was to be a punishment. So in the curse, God said, you are from dust, so dust you will to return. That is the pronouncement right there of mortality. That is when man it's illogical to sit there and say, I'm going to judge you with something that is already of you. Meaning, oh, you stole that, so I'm going to do such and such to you. And you look at the person, well, I don't have one of those already. Oh, well, what kind of punishment is it? Threaten you with something that you already have. So I'm going to curse you with death. Well, I'm going to die. So why are you cursing me with death if I already was going to die? I was already mortal. What good is that? See, that's an inconsistency. That is what I've been trying to explain about what is inconsistencies are all about. If it is not coherent, if it's not consistent, you got to throw it out with the bathwater. You have to throw it out with the bathwater, the whole paradigm, the whole system. God is not going to sit there and threaten them with death if they were already going to die. Illogical. Secondly, when you go to Genesis 6, God said, I will not always strive with man, but his numbers and his years now will be 120. So he started to limit man's years after that point. And it took a while for that to kick in. But we see that by the time we get to Moses, people are not living. And Moses himself lived 120, but most people were not living all the way. But they were dying before 120. So now his years are limited. That's not a pronouncement of mortality, but the pronouncement of the limiting of years. So it is in the curse that they were given limited years. So why do people still die physically? Because God hasn't reversed the curse yet. He paid for the sins. Okay, think about it. He sinned. On the day that you sinned, you will be punished for that sin. I will kill you. So Adam and Eve sinned. God shows up. You did wrong. And instead of killing Adam and Eve, or Adam and leaving Eve by herself, he did what? He clothed them with skins. That is what a life for a life. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. I've heard Don deny this. I've heard many predators deny the whole idea that God sacrificed an animal and it was that animal that died in their place. They reject that theology. I can't stress enough. You go back to Genesis. Why in the world did they ever even mention it? Why is the symbolism of an animal sacrifice there so important that later on, what happens when God sets up the sacrificial system under the law of Moses? It was an animal dying in a person's place. What did the animal do in the garden? It died in Adam and Eve's place. To deny that is utter craziness. I don't see how they can sit there and try to justify any type of argument that moves away from that point. And that's the whole issue. The whole problem with their whole systems. And this is just in one small point that I'm trying to get this across. I don't want to be here all night, of course. Why does he still experience the punishment if there's no more sin? Do you understand that it was Christ who died as a punishment for our sins? If he died for our sins, then why would we have to die for our sins? We don't. We die because we are mortal. Here's the other theological point to that thing. Why do you think under the curse, under a curse of mortality, separated from carnal nature? It has no life in God. Paul says, I serve God with my mind, but with my flesh, the law of sin and death. And it doesn't matter how much of a spiritual person you are, you're going to sin. you're going to choose to do things wrong. Sin still exists within this mortal body where we do things that we know that we should not do. Oh, death, where's your sting, right? Or actually go back to Romans 8 and everything. There is now, therefore, no condemnation to them that are in Christ Jesus of sin, because he has looked over our sin. Why? Because they were covered over by the blood of Christ. What does that mean? It was because he was punished for our sin. He died in our place. That's all of what atonement is. So why should we have to die for our sin? Why would our physical death have anything to do with a punishment for it when I've lived out my full 120 years and then my body gives out, everything gives out, and I die? Now, the point I was getting back to is, why did God limit everybody's life? Why did he do that? Well, if you've got this vile, lowly body that Paul calls, wow, can you imagine if we had to live forever? There is no redemption for our bodies. We are stuck in this body forever without it ever possibility being changed until Christ comes, of course. And then now that's the whole promise of the resurrection. For those who have died, we get to be raised up into that new body. That body that was in the ground comes out new and changed. And those who are alive, their bodies change and become glorious to be like. It was God's mercy that said that you were absolutely ludicrous. The idea is this. My brother is guilty for committing murder, and he's put up on death row, and I choose to die in his place, and I choose, and I die him. Does he of sin spiritually? Being God, how can dead experience death, spiritual separation, because he was God? You can't have God separating for God. And that phrase on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? You got to remember, Jesus is still very much human. I mean, he cursed a tree because he was hungry and didn't have anything on it. He cried, he wept, he slept. He was human in all those parts. So here he is hanging on the cross. He's accepted the punishment of all mankind's sin. And his words were, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why? And that word, when you research it in the Greek, it is not, there's no idea all of a sudden God is no longer God. They've separated, and he's renounced his son because he sinned, and now he's got to go into hell and die or anything else. It has to do with the fact that, my God, why have you forsaken me on this cross? Why have you left me here to die? This is a man's plea and a cry out from a man who is in physical agony and dying. And he knows that God could save him in a heartbeat and take him off this cross. But instead, he's left there. My God, why have you forsaken? Why have you abandoned me in this position? Why did I have to do this? And that is the simple cry of his heart. And it had nothing to do with him experiencing spiritual death or God leaving him, because he was God. So he never suffered spiritual death on the cross. There was no separation from him. It was always about the physical death. And I've heard these comments from Steve Basden and the others about all of this, the blood of Christ and all that. People, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. He had to die physically. That was the only way, because that was the judgment against Adam in the garden. On that day that you eat, you will surely die. Capital punishment, finish it. It was Christ who died for him. Do you see how that they... Wow, for understand it. How can do it? Oh, somebody put up here, who's the red vixen on the wall? Okay. Yeah, you're talking about that. Oh, shut the tree. Yeah, couldn't wait to start recording. Couldn't even shut them chest drawers. Oh, yeah. My sock is sitting out. Well, this is a fancy office, obviously, so no, I couldn't. All right. I love it. Anyway, so he goes on to say, so if Jesus came to fix physical death, he failed miserably. And say Jesus never came to fix physical death. He never did that. He came to pay the price, the penalty, and the punishment for our sin. A couple other comments here. I think it was from Ron. Adam was created in the midst of creation, and here's why. And I've already said it's impossible for him to be created. He was created outside of Eden, where the rest of the creation was. Eden in Genesis. The idea is that garden. The idea of God, and he was relationship with God. The garden was the temple. The idea is that that is the place where him and God were dwelt together. So that is why Adam moved into the garden with Eve. And what was in the garden? Sin yet, not been cursed of everything that is as there was nothing inside. Yeah, this is a thing. The existence of food required death to assure the and it's constant. If you have no death of animals, nothing in each other or any other kind of physical death to animals. As I said, the life of the animal is in the blood. If it does not have blood, it's not considered to be live in the sense that we are. There's that separation of it. So seeds, plants can produce seeds, but that doesn't mean the tree dies. We don't know what kind of seasons, but if it was a temperate climate, for instance, like in Hawaii, there's barely seasons change. You don't see season change in the, in some places, so they don't. And food requires the presence of physical death. Why? No, it doesn't. You can eat. Food was given to them not for sustenance in the sense of you got to eat it to stay alive. Even though they were eating, you could eat of it. The idea is that the pleasure of, think about it, the orange, all these things. Eating was not there to be to stay alive, but it was for the pleasure of it, for something to enjoy, something God created for our senses to enjoy. This is now the theology I'm giving you here has been around for 2,000 years. I'm sorry, I know people don't buy into all these stories, but that's been there and had been established right from the beginning. So you don't need cycles of nature and death to assure that. It just the constant renewal. There, you don't have to constantly renew something if it is not dying. So that's an assumption that he makes. He takes the cursed land and then compares it with the land before and tries to say that the earth before that was the same way as it was after, and that's not true. Adam was made out of dust and destined to return to it. That being in the image of God does not imply physicality. That's not true. If we are in the image of God, it doesn't talk about the substance of. It means the image of, the image of personality of the way we look and things like this. God does not have wings or chicken wings or anything else like that. And it says he has a back and a hand, and it's described. And when angels, they appeared, when they appeared, they looked just like us. And it's not because they looked like us, because they're modeling after us. It's because we look like them. We were modeled after them. When angels appear, it's not because they're going to look like us, it's because, we're the originals and they're all the copies. We're the copies of God and how we look, the physicality of what we are. And so it's God. See, those are idiotic type of questions. No, God is not made of dust. God is spirit. But Jesus was the one who became a man and took on our human body. So his son brought physical death and physical needs into the world, and Adam didn't need a digestive system in the beginning. So why eat? I just explained. Why would he eat? Because it was enjoyable. Oh, man, have you ever tasted a fresh orange off a tree? So God creates all these fruit trees, and all you're supposed to do is grab it, smell it, look at it. Oh, that's just wonderful, nice. And eat it. I mean, he gave you all these sentences to enjoy. And so why wouldn't he make something for you to taste and go, that's wow, that's heaven right there. That tasted so good. I mean, what I'm pointing out here is people are not thinking through things at all. So what would have happened to Adam if he hadn't eaten while he was eaten of the tree? Oh no, if he didn't eat while he wouldn't die. He was immortal. So yes, without death. If you notice the word immortal, death, our bodies are subject to death. Immortal means it's perishability, means we are subject to growing old and dying, but imperishability means we're able to. Nowhere in all of Scripture does immortal, imperishable apply to a spirit or to a you will all associated with God. Paul said, "Of life, bodies, mortal bodies." So it's always talking about the body. And that's pretty much what I wanted to go through on this first thing. And it was just a real simple one theological point. Just this one about the physicality and the death and what death is. And why this is not right. When you go down those other rabbit trails, don't make sense. Here he is. Makes sense. Why would they? The only you have to stay alive. Who said that? Where does that say in the Bible that the only reason that they had to eat was to stay alive? See, that becomes an assigning something that happened after to something before. And this is just how it kind of goes. And this is kind of, it was breaking. I see it anymore. Yeah. Well, the point here was, like in the arguments with I.O. people, if you redefine a way it was never intended to be, or to have addition attached to it, that is and not right. Your theology off of this, everything that you build off of this is completely wrong. I.O. says that Gentiles are non-practicing, non-law abiding Israelites. And I mean, this has been brought up, I don't know how many times to him. The word Gentile is a Latin phrase that means nations. So why would they translate a Greek word, nations, like Goyim, Old Testament, nations in the New? Why would they translate that into the English word nations? I mean, that would be common sense. Why would you translate it into the word and a Latin word meaning Gentiles? Why would you do that? Because the whole point, and you look up any dictionary, they deliberately use the word Gentiles to mean everything all the way across the board. Any definition you'll find out, it was meant to mean that this was a nation other than Israel. Gentiles were any other people that were not Jews. And so therefore, the minute I.O. starts off claiming this, Gentiles, they're wrong. I don't care what else they say. I don't care what arguments Jason comes up with, Bradley or anybody else. The minute you misdefine what Gentiles is, you've messed up. You've gone off the wrong rails. And there's nothing I can tell you anything more. But see, the thing is people don't want to believe that. You want to continue to argue with I.O., but it's still the same thing. It's just wrong. And so my other pet peeve here that I wanted to bring out is this. I have gotten upset with some of them, and I've called Bradley and the others, they're idiots, they're morons, they're stupid. And the idea is that Forrest Gump was an idiot. He was a moron. He was stupid. He had a low IQ. Sorry about that. That's how you define it. But I have never gone to the extremes of what they have done in the name calling and the relentless pursuit of tearing the person down instead of tearing down the theology. And at the same time, though, it is also true that somebody like Forrest Gump, who has an IQ of 80, are going to have a much harder time understanding something that comes from somebody with an IQ of 130. You're not on the same level. You're just not. You don't have the same level of education. And that is not, I'm not trying to be arrogant whatsoever, but the idea is I'm sitting there trying to talk with an IO guy, and he can't even understand what the word Gentile means. And so how other things that are a little bit more weighty, how is he going to be understood? I have no idea. Okay, I'm losing it. But the idea is that I'm starting to back away from all of that, because I'm just not going to deal with that nonsense anymore. The name calling and the language that people have been using is it's just not Christ-like. There's no character in it. And I've caught myself a couple of times just falling down into that. So I'm not going to do it anymore. So I've withdrawn. There was a meme that was put up by Rob Shannon, I think his name is. That was pretty disgusting on the other debate page. So I pulled out of that, and I'm just not going to engage that anymore. I'm not going down that road. And so over the 5 years, I think I've hit every major doctrine of preterism. I've gone through these arguments like I did here with what is the physical death, why that's important, exegetically, the mount to mount, the words and what it means, the phrase, how it's used through the whole Bible exegetically. That is exactly what it means. You cannot change that to mean something else. And that, yeah, they are idiots. Okay. And so I'm looking at the comments here, right? So what I'm talking about, getting back here, losing my train of thought here for a second. If we're going to argue with preterism, there are certain things we just cannot allow them to do, and cannot allow them to argue on. And that's by redefining words, redefining things, and making generalized statements that they cannot back up. Timing does not dictate the nature. That's ridiculous. And there's a whole lot of other things. But that's the whole point of the book. It does deal with a lot of these basic arguments. It deals with a lot of the comments that I've gotten, the inconsistencies that I've gotten from people. Don Preston, who's been caught in double talk time and time again, like when he was at Criswell College, he talked about spirit God, a body of God, and we just know that's not true. There's just no way that God has a spiritual body, a spirit body. He's spirit. Jesus, when he was resurrected, he said, a spirit does not have flesh and blood as you see that I have. And so he was resurrected in a spiritual body. Body always means a covering, flesh. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, what body is. But spiritual always means something that is from the realm of God. The manna that fell down, Paul says that was spiritual manna. That doesn't mean it was invisible manna. What that means is the bread came from God himself. It wasn't man-made. Adam, everything that comes from Adam is man-made. Everything that comes from God is spiritual, because it is spiritual from him. And that does not mean non-physical, because the manna was very physical. How do you think all those birds and the fowl and the quail that the Israelites ate in the desert wanderings, where do you think they all came from? That wasn't just a sudden herd that they came upon. This was a something that God did himself as a miracle in a way, in providing and feeding for them. So, hey, it looks like I got True Dad come back on here now. He wanted to join us. So, yeah, and this is exactly what I mean. If you look at the chats and everything else, hey, dumb shot. Then he calls me a name. I mean, your mom let you out of the basement. Witless is a douche. Who are you talking to, Witless? These are the kind of things why I do not respond to those people anymore. It shows a complete lack of education, honesty with God, maturity, and it just in between. Fayrod is somebody that we talked to from Coming Out of Preterism Facebook page. So yeah, I'm hooked up with my whole Middlesim.org, my web pages and all that is all connected up. And those are the couple of debate pages that I engage people with. And Faye is one of those. And there's others that have come out of preterism, like Sam Frost, that we there and we talk and we discuss, and we're willing to talk with Green or anybody else. But it comes down to the bottom line. No, she's not hot. She's an older lady. Sorry about that, Faye. Anyway, I'm joking here. Um, the idea is that we want to engage people theologically and point out an inconsistency and why something isn't true, and give the alternate explanations theologically why. And again, I brought up the point: physical death. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission for sin. So I'm not going to respond further to True Dad. He really is too immature for me to deal with right now. With all of that said, my goal then for the next is looking for discussions is to deal with things theologically and bring these things to continue to answer for those who need answers. And hopefully you can read the book, get the book and read it. It is available in the Kindle edition. If you have Kindle Prime, it's free. To get a Kindle book is $9.99. And the other is the 19, I think it was, for the book edition. And it's been 5 years of me working on that thing and putting all these discussions and trying to condense them all down. And so I'm finding myself now starting to recycle as new people come on all the way across the board on these different Facebook pages. And they're just being recycled and it's coming back to the same questions again. But the rhetoric has gotten worse. And now the issues between preterism of IBV versus CBV, those things have all been continued to be argued and debated back and forth. Don Preston, he is from Ardmore, Oklahoma. That's where he's at. And anything else? Nope, no other questions and everything. So I've had you here long enough, and I think gone on kind of personal. Don't stop preaching. Well, I've been trying to deal with just specific arguments and everything else, and we don't have anybody like True Dad to actually come on and do it. Don't say they want me to stop, but I'm not. It's not that I can come back and do this again. But tonight I just wanted to really, and people are going to read for this later on, but to deal with that physical death and just to make sure that that whole point comes across there. So with that said, I want to thank you guys for showing up. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel. That way you'll know when I do it. I'll do this again, and I'll keep doing it up. And it was kind of fun. I like having, more comments and things brought up. And so we get more people in there. It'll be interesting. I am looking forward to David Gates and John Watson and engaging with some of those other men. And okay, you're not going to let me go. Is that the idea? Do you believe in hell? Do I believe in a lake of fire where people will go and suffer eternal torment? I'm going to clarify it real quick. What the lake of fire is the punishment for our sin. And God had to make it drastic enough that people would not want it. So if you have the choice between stealing a candy bar and not stealing a candy bar, because if you get caught stealing a candy bar, somebody's going to take you and throw you into a lake of burning fire, you're not going to want to do it. But see, people don't want to in a lake of fire. They don't want to believe that the idea that you get thrown in there forever because it's so terrible. And the idea I think Christ is trying to get across is the outer darkness, wherever we're thrown at, whatever place that really is, it is complete separation from God, where you experience death continually. And it is not a place that God sent you. You chose to go there because you rejected God. And God says, okay, I'm giving you what you want. You had a choice to either eat of the fruit of the tree of life or to eat of the other. So my connection is unstable, so it's messing up. And so we don't know where the lake of fire is. And what book? It is Middlesim Eschatology. You can find it on Amazon.com. True that. Okay. If that is a subject you really want to talk about, we'll do it at another time, but not obviously tonight. I'm not going to go through all these, um, uh, especially the way you talked with me before and the name calling. So we're being disconnected, it seems. So thank you guys for being here, and we will have. I'll post the next time that we get to talk. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here, and until we meet again. Bye.